Otto von Bismarck never trusted moments of silence that came too easily, because in his experience, silence usually meant that someone was thinking, planning, or waiting, and waiting was often more dangerous than open opposition. From early in his career, he learned that the absence of noise was not peace, but preparation, and this belief shaped how he listened, how he paused, and how he controlled conversations without appearing to dominate them. Bismarck suffered from recurring periods of deep exhaustion, both physical and mental, long before he reached the height of his power. He complained of headaches, stomach pain, insomnia, and sudden drops in energy, but he rarely allowed these weaknesses to surface publicly because he believed visible fatigue invited pressure. To him, a tired leader became a negotiable leader, and negotiation was something he preferred to initiate, not endure. He had an unusual relationship with anger. Unlike many politicians of his time, Bismarck did not explode impulsively. His anger was slow, controlled, and often delayed. When he felt insulted or threatened, he stored the emotion rather than releasing it, allowing it to mature into calculation. This made his responses feel disproportionate to outsiders, because they were never reactions to the present moment, but settlements of older accounts. Bismarck believed that people revealed more through routine than through confession. He paid close attention to how often someone repeated the same argument, the same concern, the same tone, because repetition indicated fear or obsession. He rarely interrupted others, not out of politeness, but because prolonged speech exhausted opponents and increased the likelihood of mistakes. Despite his reputation as a ruthless strategist, Bismarck distrusted speed. He associated haste with emotional decision-making and believed that quick victories often concealed long-term instability. Many of his most decisive actions were preceded by long periods of apparent inactivity, during which others assumed he was indecisive or distracted. In reality, these pauses were deliberate, designed to let external pressures grow unbearable for everyone except himself. He was deeply uncomfortable with idealists. Bismarck believed ideals were dangerous precisely because they felt pure to those who held them. In his view, idealism removed the internal brakes that normally limited human behavior. This is why he preferred dealing with cynics, opportunists, and pragmatists, people who understood cost and compromise, because they could be predicted. Bismarck used illness strategically, sometimes exaggerating his condition to withdraw from negotiations or delay decisions without appearing weak. Illness gave him distance, and distance allowed control. While others speculated about his health, he observed how quickly alliances shifted in his absence, taking mental notes on loyalty and impatience. He feared crowds, not in the sense of physical danger, but psychological unpredictability. Bismarck believed crowds erased individual responsibility, replacing it with emotional momentum. He distrusted mass enthusiasm and preferred governance through layers, paperwork, and intermediaries, where emotion could be slowed down and diluted. His working habits were irregular and intentionally confusing. Meetings were scheduled at unusual hours, documents were returned unpredictably, and decisions were announced without warning. This was not chaos, but a method. By disrupting expectations, Bismarck prevented others from building strategies around his routine, forcing them to react rather than plan. Bismarck believed loyalty was temporary by nature. He never assumed gratitude would last, and he never relied on past favors as insurance for future obedience. This made him unusually calm when allies turned against him, because betrayal, to him, was not a moral failure, but a structural certainty. He was deeply aware of his public image but treated it as armor rather than decoration. His cultivated bluntness, his harsh language, and his dismissive tone were intentional. By appearing crude, he lowered expectations of diplomacy while masking a precise understanding of psychological leverage. Bismarck distrusted enthusiasm, even his own. When something excited him too much, he paused, suspecting manipulation or self-deception. He believed that strong emotional alignment with an idea made one blind to its consequences, and blindness was incompatible with survival in politics. He read extensively but selectively, often abandoning books halfway through if they confirmed opinions he already held. He valued contradiction more than agreement, seeking texts that challenged his instincts rather than flattered them. Intellectual comfort, he believed, was another form of stagnation. Bismarck believed fear was more stable than admiration. Admiration required constant reinforcement, while fear sustained itself. However, he preferred subtle fear, fear of unpredictability, fear of delay, fear of exclusion, rather than fear of punishment. Punishment created martyrs, uncertainty created compliance. He rarely explained his decisions fully, even to close allies. Explanation, in his view, created points of attack. The less people understood the logic behind a decision, the harder it was to dismantle it publicly. Despite his power, Bismarck feared becoming symbolic rather than functional. He resisted ceremonial roles and avoided being reduced to a figurehead because symbolism without control felt like slow erasure. This fear intensified later in life as political systems grew larger and less personal. He understood that power did not collapse loudly. It eroded quietly, through routines that stopped being questioned, through habits that lost relevance, through confidence that hardened into arrogance. He watched for these signs obsessively, often correcting them before others noticed anything was wrong. Bismarck believed that most conflicts were not caused by ideology, but by impatience. People rushed outcomes they were not ready to manage. His greatest advantage, he believed, was his ability to wait longer than everyone else in the room. He accepted contradiction as part of governance. Policies changed, positions shifted, and alliances reversed, not because he lacked principles, but because he believed rigidity was more dangerous than inconsistency. Survival required adaptation, not purity. Even at the height of his influence, Bismarck remained cautious, guarded, and skeptical of permanence. Power, to him, was not owned, only rented, and the rent was paid daily through attention, discipline, and restraint. Otto von Bismarck never trusted moments of enthusiasm, not in politics, not in people, not even in himself, because he believed excitement shortened judgment and made decisions irreversible before they were fully understood. He was deeply suspicious of sudden agreement. When too many people supported an idea too quickly, he assumed something dangerous was being ignored, and often delayed decisions not to refine them, but to see who would lose patience first. Bismarck believed exhaustion was one of the most effective political tools. He allowed discussions to stretch endlessly, meetings to drag on without resolution, knowing that tired opponents revealed priorities, emotions, and weaknesses far more clearly than rested ones. He deliberately cultivated an image of emotional instability, outbursts, mood swings, dramatic reactions, because it made others underestimate his long-term planning. While in reality, most of his behavior was calculated to create uncertainty around his intentions. Bismarck suffered from recurring depressive episodes and spoke openly in private about his fear of becoming mentally stagnant, not powerless, but irrelevant. And this fear drove his constant need to stay involved in every layer of governance. He disliked public speaking more than his reputation suggested, not because he lacked confidence, but because spoken words could not be revised. Once released, they escaped control, something he found deeply uncomfortable. Bismarck preferred written communication even with close allies, believing that writing forced discipline, clarity, and accountability, while conversation allowed people to hide behind tone and improvisation. He distrusted idealists instinctively, not because he thought them immoral, but because he believed they valued consistency over outcomes. And in politics, consistency often led to unnecessary destruction. Bismarck viewed compromise not as weakness, but as delay, a way to shift consequences into the future where circumstances might soften them. And many of his compromises were designed not to resolve conflict, but to postpone its explosion. He rarely attacked opponents directly. Instead, he isolated them slowly, cutting access, reducing relevance, allowing them to fade without dramatic confrontation. Because defeated enemies were remembered, forgotten ones were not. Bismarck understood that public outrage burned quickly, but quiet dissatisfaction lingered, which is why he often allowed scandals to resolve themselves. Trusting time to dilute attention rather than force closure, he believed systems mattered more than individuals. Yet he never trusted systems to function without constant pressure, supervision, and adjustment, seeing bureaucracy as something that naturally drifted toward inertia. Bismarck was intensely aware of hierarchy, but avoided rigid loyalty, preferring flexible dependence. relationships that could be reconfigured without collapse when circumstances changed. He believed transparency was dangerous in unstable environments, not because people could not handle truth, but because truth without context created panic, misinterpretation, and unnecessary action. Despite being associated with forceful leadership, Bismarck relied heavily on restraint, choosing not to act when others expected him to, allowing tension to mature until options became clearer. He feared revolutionary energy not for its violence, but for its unpredictability, because unpredictable movements could not be negotiated with, delayed, or exhausted. Bismarck viewed politics as a psychological terrain, where perception shaped behavior long before laws or force were applied, and he invested more energy in managing expectations than enforcing obedience. He was highly sensitive to shifts in tone within institutions, noticing when language became sharper, when complaints repeated, when formality eroded. Seeing these as early signs of deeper instability, Bismarck believed authority weakened when it explained itself too often. Excessive justification signaled insecurity, and he preferred decisions that appeared inevitable rather than debated. He avoided presenting policies as personal victories, framing them instead as necessities imposed by circumstance. Removing emotional ownership and reducing resistance, Bismarck was acutely aware that power created isolation, and he accepted this as structural rather than emotional. Believing closeness compromised judgment, he distrusted popularity deeply, seeing it as a temporary illusion that encouraged reckless decisions designed to maintain approval rather than stability. He preferred controlled dissatisfaction to enthusiastic loyalty, because dissatisfied people remained cautious, while enthusiastic ones eventually demanded rewards. Bismarck believed fear was effective only when subtle, overt intimidation created resistance, while quiet uncertainty encouraged compliance without confrontation. He managed rivals not by humiliating them, but by overwhelming them with complexity, procedural delays, and administrative friction until ambition became fatigue. He believed leadership required emotional containment, the ability to experience anger, doubt, and frustration without allowing them to dictate action. Bismarck saw history not as a moral judge, but as a selective editor, remembering outcomes while forgetting intentions. And he structured his decisions accordingly. He accepted that some policies would fail, but believed visible failure was preferable to hidden decay, because failure could be corrected while decay spread unnoticed. He believed that decisive moments were rare, and that most of governance consisted of waiting, monitoring, and maintaining balance rather than dramatic intervention. Bismarck viewed resignation as a form of control. Stepping away before being pushed preserved authority and narrative, and he feared being removed more than leaving voluntarily. He understood that power was sustained through routine, predictability, and repetition, not constant assertion, and he protected these elements carefully. He believed leaders should appear replaceable, while quietly ensuring they were not, balancing visibility and indispensability. Bismarck feared emotional attachment to outcomes. Believing attachment narrowed perspective and encouraged defensive decisions, he cultivated an image of bluntness to discourage overanalysis of his words, allowing him to communicate indirectly without being challenged directly. He believed patience was not passive but active, a form of pressure applied through time rather than force. He rarely expressed certainty, preferring controlled ambiguity, because ambiguity slowed opposition and preserved flexibility. Bismarck accepted loneliness as an operational cost, not a personal tragedy, and structured his life around this acceptance. He believed power was not maintained through constant movement, but through controlled stillness, allowing others to exhaust themselves. And in the end, Bismarck ruled not because he was ruthless, but because he understood limitation, his own and others, and learned how to operate within those limits longer, calmer, and more precisely than those around him.